when really embarrassing things happen, we don't really want our name or our photo attached to the stories that tell of our vulnerability. And but if you'll permit me, I'd like to be a little vulnerable with you and tell you a personal story. In the last story I told about the tourist who gets lost looking for herself, thankfully, in the article that I read and in the viral sensation that followed, her photo wasn't printed and her name wasn't printed. Otherwise, that takes a lot to recover from when you become international news for getting lost looking for yourself. But I do want to talk a little bit about a story that happened to me. Actually, two stories, but I'll start with the first in sequence. I got an email, as I often do. I'm invited to teach in different parts of the world, and I travel a lot for work as a missionary. And so I got an email from a friend, and she basically explained that she had been invited to go and teach in Finland, and she wasn't able to go anymore because of a conflict. She had to attend a meeting that same week that she didn't know about when she accepted the invitation. And so the school leader had said to her, is there anybody else that you can recommend who could teach on the same subject? And so she thought of me. And so she ended up CCing me into an email and saying, this is Aleck. He's from Africa, and he would be great to teach on this subject for that week. And so I got an email from the school leader as a response, and he said, are you available on these dates? And I looked at my calendar, and I was available. I'm free. So I replied and said, yeah, I would love to come. I've never been to Finland before. It's about as far removed from Africa and Zimbabwe, where I come from, as I could imagine. And so he booked the tickets for me. He organized everything for me to fly in, and the goal was to fly into Helsinki. And as soon as you arrive in Helsinki, in the capital, you move from the big jet plane into a smaller little proper plane that takes you up north where I was going to be teaching for the week. And so I arrived in Helsinki. I was excited to be somewhere I've never been before. Every year I get to cross off one or two new countries that I get to go to because of my travels as a missionary. And so I landed in Helsinki. I went through immigration, so you know the drill. You have to hand over your passport and they check your details. And then I boarded the smaller little prop plane and flew up to where the location was where I would land. And I was just excited to be there. Normally what happens is I arrive in the airport, and the first thing that I do is I go to the arrivals area and I stand there and I put my luggage at my feet and I put on my lost face. And I just kind of look around and I'm waiting for the people to pick me up. And this happens all over the world, countless times every year. Sometimes I know the people before I go. Sometimes we know each other very little. Sometimes we've never met before, ever. And so, it's all just part of the missionary life. And so I'm standing there in the arrivals area and I put on my lost face and I keep looking around, and, you know, it's getting harder and harder to spot other, youth with the missionaries because we're not all youth anymore. We're all ages with the mission. And unless they're wearing something with the logo, the YWAM logo for our organization, it's a little hard to tell who the YWAMers are and who is just a passerby or, And as I'm standing there, I realized more and more people were getting picked up. And, there's one man is standing there and his wife runs up to him and gives him this big bear hug. And there's another gentleman who is picked up by a taxi, and he has a sign for the university. He's obviously a university professor, and all manner of people are getting picked up in all manner of ways. And I'm standing there just completely lost, and it felt like an eternity. Sometimes the team that's picking me up will come very quickly, and at other times there's a delay or there's something wrong. And this time I must have stood for 45 minutes, and I wasn't sure who was picking me up or what the deal was. And so I just stood there patiently with my luggage at my feet in the middle of the arrivals area. And then I started to notice that there were two young people, and they were kind of circling me very reminiscent of vultures in Africa, where the birds just kind of circle and circle and circle around a dead carcass, waiting for the final signs of life before they swoop in. And eventually I kind of noticed them, and I watched them moving around, and I decided, well, there's nothing to lose. Let me walk up to them and ask them if they're from YWAM. And so I walked up to them, and they were two young people, and I said to them, "Are you guys from YWAM?" And they said, "Yeah, we're YWAMers." And I said, "Oh, that's wonderful. I'm also a YWAMer." And they said, "Oh, that's a coincidence." And so I said, "Are you from this particular location, YWAM location?" And they said yes. And I was like, "Oh, that's brilliant, because I'm going to that location." And they said, "Oh, really?" And I said, "Yes. Are you school leaders on the discipleship training school?" And they said, "Yes, we are." And so I said to them, "Oh, okay, wonderful. I'm your speaker for the week." And they looked closely at me, and they shook their heads. No. There's something wrong. And they kept looking at me a little weird. And finally they said, do you have any identification? So I've just been through the immigration in Helsinki, and now I've landed in this small town and in the local airport, and now they're asking me to give them ID again, show them my passport. And of course I was happy to do that. I don't mind a little misunderstanding as long as we can resolve it. And they kept looking at me, and then looking at my passport, and looking back at me, and they looked very confused and a little shocked. And I kept explaining, I'm Aleck Cartwright, the one who emailed, and they finally said, "Okay, we'll go back to the base. We just need to check with the location, the leader, and he can just confirm that you're our speaker for the week, because you're not at all what we were expecting." And now this was a little bit of a shock, I think, to them and to me. Usually when I arrive at places, they have some clue of who I am, but this time, because of the nature of the invitation, they didn't realize that I was African. And of course this is what walks out, and the disappointment was kind of tangible. They looked at me and they were like, no, our speaker is from Africa, and you don't look anything like what we envisioned our speaker to be like. And so of course it turned into a big joke. We ended up driving back to the base, and they checked with the necessary people to make sure that I was the real deal. Now, part of what complicates this, just like the previous story, is that, some things get lost in translation. I no longer have a Zimbabwean passport. I became stateless. I was without country, without documentation for a year of my life. While I got British citizenship, it took me 5 years to get British citizenship. And in that last year, being stateless was a kind of terrifying thing. I no longer have any documentation that tells me that I'm Zimbabwean or from Zimbabwe. I now have a British passport. And I've lived equal amounts of time in Africa and in the UK. But I feel more African in my bones than I do European or British. And so it was just such an interesting thing, because if I wasn't granted citizenship, I would have to claim asylum or become a refugee, which, looking like this, is a little confusing to people anyway. Never mind the fact that I come from nowhere and sound like nothing as a Zimbabwean. So it was an interesting experience. We ended up laughing about it. They thought it was hilarious. At the community meeting, they invite other people to come into the community to hear a short message, and they asked me to share, and I was happy to do so. And they introduced me as, an African who doesn't look like an African, and to not be afraid that I am legit and that I am from where I come from, even though my outsides are so different than the expectation. And it turned into kind of a fun experience. They enjoyed the week. I enjoyed being with them. It was a great school. We learned a lot together, and so they started to invite me in a recurring manner. Year after year, I would go to the same location to teach, and I enjoyed it every time I went. And I went in all different seasons of the year. So I would go in the summertime, I would go in the spring, I'd go in the autumn, And now it was the turn of the winter, and so they invited me again. Again, they booked my tickets. The school leader changed in the interim years. This was now my fifth time going back to Finland, and so they booked my ticket again during the winter. There's a beautiful lake near the base, and it freezes over at times, so you can walk across the lake. It's very, very beautiful. The one time I went there, about the third day that I was there, I decided to walk across the lake, and I did so. And that evening I was recounting the tale because I could hear the ice cracking under my feet. And they said, normally when we do that at this stage in the year, we take a long stick and we put a knife on the end of it just in case you fall through the ice, then you can kind of drag yourself up again. I had lots of wonderful experiences on that base. It was the first time that I had ever really spent a lot of time in a sauna, which is kind of necessary if you're from Finland. Even Finnish missionaries in Africa, the first thing I've heard that they build is a sauna in the middle of the community, which didn't make a lot of sense to me because the outside weather in Africa is just like a sauna. But I remember they cut a hole in the lake so that we could go into the ice water, and then from the ice water to the sauna, and then back to the ice water, and your body gets very confused as to what torture you're inflicting upon it. But apparently it's very good for your health and your immune system and your energy levels. Ice baths are very popular now. So anyway, I loved being there. It was just so different than anywhere I'd been before. And now it was time to go back. And apparently to go back in every season. And so the next time they invited me, I again flew into Helsinki. It was freezing cold, 6 foot of ice, a lot of snow. And I flew into Helsinki as usual. I had already prepared so that they would know that I was coming. And they knew what to expect after that experience of being invited. And people expecting an African man with much darker complexion than I have. I started, whenever I was invited to a school that didn't quite know me, I would attach a little photo to the email in response to go, hey, this is what I look like, just so you can find me in the airport. And we do this reasonably often just to make sure that things are not lost in translation or things don't get confused. I remember going to Singapore, and I went there for a conference, and I was there for about 5 days. But my luggage, which I checked in, took a holiday in Dubai. So while I was in Singapore wearing the same T-shirt every day and the same pair of jeans and had to buy a toothbrush, my wonderful luggage, I don't know, it was having the most wonderful days vacation riding camels and hanging out in Dubai. And from that point onwards, I said to myself, well, I'm not going to check luggage anymore. I'm going to carry my little rolling luggage onto the plane with me. As long as I know it's with me, everything is good. I'm not losing my toothbrush again or anything valuable. And so from that point onwards, I don't check luggage. I carry the luggage with me. And that's going to become important in the second part of this story. Knowing where we are, knowing what God is doing in our lives is really important. And an awareness that we may not be perceived in the way that we think we would is also important in this part of the narrative. So I'll tell you the second part in the next video. All I want you to think about is how this kind of embodied reality. I don't get to travel the world in anything other than this body, with this genealogy, with this DNA, with this story. And there's something beautiful about that. I'm Zimbabwean. My country has been through a brutal dictatorship. We got independence from Britain in 1980. It's all tied up in who I am as a human being. Now I have a British passport. For a year I was stateless. These stories, whether you were talking about Moses or Joseph or Paul, these characters in scripture, they often had dual identities. And they were having to navigate one or the other of their identities, of their citizenship. And of course, as Christians, whether you're a missionary or any other vocation, we have a dual citizenship. Because we are not only born of the earth, but we are born of the Spirit, and we have a citizenship in heaven, as well as here on earth. And that's really what we're talking about when we get into the nitty-gritty of these subjects, is we're trying to navigate both, because we often think that we're spiritual beings, or that we're human beings, and we don't realize how these two aspects of our nature as image bearers are important and are interrelated. So we often feel like we're on a spiritual journey, but we are equally so on a human one. And that's what we're going to talk about next.